Good evening and welcome to tonight's Center for Jewish Life program. I am Rabbi David Woznica, and a few months ago I had the opportunity to have a dialogue with Dr. Deborah Lipstadt. We had a wide-ranging discussion covering the state of Jewish life today, anti-Semitism, and other issues facing America. For those of you who have heard Dr. Lipstadt before, you undoubtedly have high expectations. And dare I say, I think after watching this, you will feel that your expectations were warranted. And if you are hearing from her for the first time, well, you are in for a treat. The next program at our Center for Jewish Life, which we will present live, virtually, is with Deborah Tannen. She's best known for her book, You Just Don't Understand, which was a New York Times bestseller for 4 years. She's just written Finding My Fathers. She'll be with us on December 1st. And then on January 11th, Liel Leibovitz, senior writer for Tablet and a most interesting and original thinker, will join us. I encourage you to register for both events. And finally, thank you for being with us. I hope you enjoy tonight's program. Friends, dear friends, it's so good to see you tonight, and it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our guest. Dr. Deborah Lipstadt is the Roth Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Her books include Beyond Belief, The American Press and the Coming of the Holocaust, 1933 to 1945. She's written Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory, Denial, Holocaust History on Trial, the Eichmann trial, which she came to Stephen Wise some years ago to speak about, and Holocaust and American Understanding. There is so much to be shared about her, but we'd rather hear from her than about her. But there's two things that are particularly noteworthy. She held presidential appointments to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, appointed by Presidents Clinton and Obama, and she was selected by President Bush to represent the White House at the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And she won a teaching award, the Everett Williams Teaching Award, selected by the alumni as the teacher who had most influenced them, which is a real credit to her. So my friends, please join me in welcoming Dr. Deborah Lipstadt.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. I've been standing at that pulpit that was on the screen just a few moments ago, many a time. I've had that glass of wine, and I hope one day to again be at the pulpit, more importantly, to be sharing a l'chaim with you face to face and not virtually.
Thank you very much. I share that as well. There are three areas that I hope we'll be able to focus on. The state of Jewish life, I think, is important and a great opportunity to learn from you. Obviously, anti-Semitism. And finally, let's talk about America today, some of the things that are happening in this country. And if there's time, we'll touch on Israel. But let's start with the state of Jewish life. Everybody knows what an extraordinary student you are of anti-Semitism. You're also, however, a deeply passionate, you're a committed religious Jew. You have a keen understanding of Jewish life as well, and you care about Jewish commitment. I'm curious, when you entered Jewish life several decades ago, you probably felt that Jews were increasingly inclined to living more committed Jewish lives. What's your assessment today? Do you think Jews are becoming more or less interested in their Judaism?
You know, a few months ago would have been easier for me to answer that. I entered Jewish life really in the late 1960s after having been a student in Israel at the Hebrew University, 1966, 67, meaning I was there during the war. I traveled to the Soviet Union, 1972, arriving there the day after the Munich massacre. And then I came back to Brandeis University and committed to get my PhD and going on to a career having taught in Seattle, in LA, and now for many years in Atlanta. And I've been very lucky. I was on the up curve. You were a little bit behind me, but not that far. And I remember when I came to LA, Rabbi Zeldin was active as the rabbi. So I've really experienced this growth spurt of Jewish life, of Jewish identity, of people sort of heralding their Jewish life and not hiding it, of celebrating difference. And that's in part because of the changes in American life, which dovetails with what I'm going to get to about today. Because if we think about the late 60s, the early 70s, the Black liberation movement, Black power movement, whatever you want to call it, the Stonewall, the gay revolution, groups were coming out of the woodwork, so to speak, and saying, you know, we're going to celebrate, we're Americans, but we're going to celebrate who we are. And Jews went along with it. And we saw, of course, the extraordinary growth in Jewish studies on campus, including at UCLA and USC in your own backyard. So I've been very optimistic. I'm an optimistic person, which I think is the only reason I'm able to study the terrible subjects I do. To turn to today, I'm going to punt a little bit and say it openly and honestly to all the people listening and watching, in part because I don't know. 3-4 months ago, I might have been more affirmative, but this pandemic has not only locked us down, and it's amazing how the Jewish community has responded. The learning that goes on, you can't keep, even if you sat all day in front of your computer or your tablet, Zooming and Facebook Living and whatever else it'd be, you couldn't do everything that's going on. That is one thing that's going to change. I think some of our Jewish institutions may not survive it, some of those that were in a shakier position, not to say anything about their quality or their value, but just because of the reality of the situation. And then there's a month ago with the terrible murder of George Floyd and all that has followed, irrespective of what you think about it, that's also a turning point for our country. And we Jews so far have been sort of kept off to the side, but the student of anti-Semitism in me says that may not continue. So I don't know where we're going, but what I can say definitively, I'm going to qualify it. This is definitively, as a scholar will say, this may well be one of those turning points.
Wow. Well, let me ask you, let's turn to anti-Semitism, and let's start with a general question. I have so much to ask you about the issue of anti-Semitism, but it's a basic question and it's a vital question. What do you see at the core of anti-Semitism? In other words, what is the cause or causes of hatred of Jews? And then we'll get into some of the things you talked about. But I think this is a very vital question that Jews should ask.
Let me say something right at the outset definitively. Anti-Semitism is not disliking a Jew or Jews because of what they did. To paraphrase, some of the people I dislike most are Jews. You know, Jews can do bad things, and you can dislike them and abhor them and be whatever, repelled by what they do. But if you go from what an individual Jew does to all Jews, then you've entered anti-Semitism this way. Anti-Semitism is a form of prejudice. It has characteristics that are common to prejudice, and maybe with everything that's gone on in our country in the past 4 weeks, we deserve to look at what is prejudice. And anti-Semitism has certain things that are unique. And so if you'll give me a minute, let me lay that out. Prejudice. What's the etymology of the word prejudice? Go back to your high school and college courses in English language. Prejudge. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. I know what you're thinking. I know what you're saying. I know because you are a Jew, because you are gay, because you are a person of color, because you are an Asian, or whatever it might be. I know who you're going to be. I've prejudged. My colleague and someone whom I think you know, Jonathan Crane, Rabbi Jonathan Crane here at Emory, a graduate of HUC, always says that you meet the stereotype in front of your nose while the person is still 2 blocks away. That's prejudice. So I prejudge a Jew. Now, what's the template of of the prejudice towards Jew, which we call anti-Semitism. I would say it has four characteristics. One is looking at something to do with money. The Jew is wealthy, the Jew controls banks, it has something to do with money. The other thing is the Jew is smart, but not in an affirmative way. The Jew is nefariously, maliciously, deviously clever, not a positive kind of thing. And the third thing would be the Jew punches above his or her weight, a small number, but one that controls. You know, that's why we bristle when we hear the word the Jewish lobby or the Israel lobby, however the term may be, because we know it's implying those Jews small in number, but they control things. And the fourth characteristic, and these all apply to today, for the various reasons. I've been reading the stuff about what went on in Charlottesville just now, because I'm writing something about it quite closely, and it was all there at the rally of Unite the Right a couple of years ago. The fourth thing is that the Jew, and this has its roots in Christian church anti-Semitism, the Jew is like the devil. In Christian theology, what is the characteristic of the devil? The devil has two characteristics. A, they come in disguise, so you don't know you're encountering the devil until after the devil has come and gone. So A, you can't identify them, and they do their handiwork in secret and they're gone. So if you think of those four things and you use them as a template, you can pretty much figure out whether something is anti-Semitic or not. Now, I just said anti-Semitism is like a prejudice, like racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever ism you want to put there. But it has something different, and I think this is important. It has certain unique characteristics, and I want to focus on two. One is a conspiracy theory. The Jew, that the Jew conspires to do us harm, that the Jew is conspiring, is figuring out, whether because of their loyalties to other Jews, the Jew is doing something bad to us. And for that, and secondly, and related to that, that the Jew's interests are his or her, or whatever term you want to, whatever pronoun you want to use, well-being to the detriment of others. They don't care. Maybe it doesn't hurt others, but the Jew doesn't care. The Jew only cares about their own. And I know I've been going on a long time and you have lots of questions, David, but I'm going to speak over you. What the heck? You know? One last point. Let me give you an example of what I've been saying. Holocaust denial. Why do so many of us viscerally know that Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism? And of course, it's obvious denial of the worst tragedy to happen to our people, the worst genocides in history, etc. But if you were to ask a denier, you know, if you convinced somehow you came tabula rasa and you were sitting next to a denier and they convinced you that the Holocaust never happened, the logical question you would ask is, well, what's in it for the Jews? Why do they go this effort to make up this story, to build museums, to build Holocaust centers, to run courses, etc.? And the denier would say to you, what did the Jews, and I put this in very big air quotes, get out of the Holocaust? And the two answers that are usually given. One is right and one is wrong. They're the standard answers. One, of course, people say reparations, which is a fancy word for money. Jews got money out of it. The Jewish community, much of Israel was rebuilt with that. Individual Jews got reparation. Of course, no reparation could repair the horrors, but money. And the second thing that is often given is the state of Israel, even though those of us who know the history of the state of Israel know there would have been some sort of political entity without the Holocaust, and it wasn't a direct result of the Holocaust. Israel was not a direct result of the Holocaust. That's the perception. And what they're saying by that is, you see, those Jews made up this story to rip off Germany of all these billions of dollars of whatever currency you want to use in order to get themselves a land. They didn't care what happened to the other people on that land. So suddenly the Holocaust, which should be laughed off the face of the earth because it's so ridiculous, the Holocaust denial should be laughed off the face of the earth, becomes logical to the person who has been exposed to anti-Semitism. Oh, money? Oh yeah, Jews do care about money. Oh, conniving to get a state? Well, they are devious in that way. So that's my 10-minute sort of grounding for what it is.
Excellent, thank you. So let me ask you, it's a perfect thing, because that's all, and much of your work has been looking in the past, particularly focusing on the Shoah, and yet you did something different recently. Your book, Anti-Semitism Here and Now, and the Future, actually, you write about as well, is very much about the here and the now of anti-Semitism. So share a little bit about where anti-Semitism is coming here and now.
And now.
Because that's
it's interesting.
Different than what you've been writing about previously.
Absolutely. And it was a harder book to write because of that, because it dealt with the now, and it was changing under my feet, under my pen, under my typewriter, under my computer, etc. And I'll tell you a little backstory. Originally, I had a different title for the book. It was called The Anti-Semitic Delusion, about the delusion aspect of anti-Semitism. And the people at Knopf said, no, we need a better title. And they came up with Anti-Semitism Here and Now. And I said, that sounds so alarmist. But they insisted, and when your publisher insists and they're investing all this, and you go, I said, okay, I'll go along with it. I'm a little uncomfortable. And then 2 months before the book came out came Pittsburgh. 2 months after the book came out came Poway. A few months later came Hala, and came so many other things. And suddenly Here and Now didn't seem alarmist at all. What are we facing now? What are we facing here and now? It's both something that is not new but the configuration is new. Historians of anti-Semitism, and whether you do it professionally or just that you're an avid reader, which I know many of the people on this call are, will know that we've had anti-Semitism on the right and we've had it on the left. We've had it on the right, the Nazis. Even though they had socialist in their title, they were not socialist in that sense. They were of the far right. We've seen it in many far right entities. It's certainly in Britain, the Conservative Party for much of the 19th and the 20th century was, or certainly in the 19th century, was a bastion of anti-Semitism. And of course, we've seen it on the left. Stephen S. Wise, which was one of the leaders in the Soviet Jewry movement, Karl Marx's anti-Semitism, Soviet Jewry, and of course, most recently, the Labour Party in the UK, which is now going through the spasms of rebuilding and ejecting the anti-Semites. So we've seen it on the right, we've seen it on the left. We saw it, as I mentioned, Charlottesville, the right, the BDS movement, much of the anti-Israel stuff certainly comes from the left. But what we're seeing today is both simultaneously. And rarely have we seen both simultaneously. And that's why sometimes you feel like you're being ground up between two sides. So I think that's what makes it different, that we're seeing it both places. And we're not just seeing it right and left. There is a very strong strain, and I want to be very careful because I do not want to implicate a whole group, certainly in a conversation about prejudice, that would be inappropriate. But there's a strong strain of Muslim anti-Semitism as well. Those of you who read MEMRI, M-E-M-R-I, which does translations of material from Arabic, you know this. So that too is there, even as there's so much Islamophobia in the world, or fear of Muslims. I like that better than fear of Islam, because it's a fear of Muslims in the world. So it's feeling like there's no place to turn. I have no place to turn to get a break.
So would you concur that one measure of anti-Semitism is how much it's marginalized. And if you believe that, then I want to ask you a question. I want to have you assess where it's being marginalized on the right and where it's being marginalized on the left. And are they doing a good job of marginalizing it?
When you say more, it's rejecting it.
Yeah, in other words, say it's no longer, Corbyn was mainstream. You didn't mention him by name, but the guy runs as the Labour Party. He represents,
Dharma's not. That's right.
and we have it, and on the right and on the left. What's happening here? When we see it in a party, how do they respond to it? When we see it in certain areas, because if you push it off to the side and you denounce it and you say that doesn't belong here, that's a statement. But if you don't denounce it, then you're also saying that's a statement. Silence does accept.
Right. Well, if you know the book that has shot to the top of the bestseller list, not just because of everything that's going on, but because it's a good book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Right. There's no, Elie Wiesel taught us this many times, often in his lifetime, and I bet sometimes from the pulpit of your own synagogue. In the face of evil, there's no neutrality. If you keep silence, you're siding with the oppressor.
So could I get you to give your assessment of how the right is marginalizing it or not, and how the left is marginalizing it or not?
On the right, it is, let me step back. On the left, we tend to see it as structural. What do I mean by structural? Few Jews are being beaten up by people on the left, being murdered in synagogues or in other places because they're Jews. On the far, and it's mainly the far right, on the far right, of course, it's much more violent. But on the left, just as we saw with the Labour Party, and the Labour Party now in the UK is making a Herculean effort to pull back from that, as you mentioned, it works its way into the structure. What we see on campus very often, with whether it's BDS, whether it's anti-Israelism, whether it becomes structural. In other words, it's not that we're afraid for our physical well-being,
right? But
it's being worked into the argument, and that becomes very dangerous, because what happens is people begin, that you hear it enough, and you hear your leader, it becomes accepted. You just assume, well, I love Israel, but it really is racist, or I love Israel, but they're training police to step on the necks of people, of minorities, etc., which of course is untrue. On the right, it tends to be violent, and I'm not sure, I can point here and there. On the right, it tends to be more the far right than the mainstream right wing, and the left, it comes closer to the center. But what we're seeing in the United States, and I don't care what your politics are irrelevant in here. We're seeing a failure by certain people on the right to outright condemn and say, this is not what we stand for. If some of those listening after this session want to Google Governor Pritzker of Illinois and Heil Hitler and the protests against him, or the governor of Michigan, who had her visage, not Jewish, had her visage painted with a little Hitler mustache, or a demonstration at the Ohio State Capitol in Columbus for opening up after the coronavirus lockdown there with a rat around the Jewish star. There was a failure of people who were pushing for an opening to say, that's not our politics, that's not what we stand for. For people to say, white supremacy is not only racist, it's anti-Semitic. The people on the far right who talk about white supremacy are not including Jews. To them, Jews are not white. As I said, I've been reading the Charlottesville material. When they said, Jews will not replace us, what were they chanting? They were chanting that it's part of a theory that is prevalent on the right, that there is a plan afoot to overtake white Christian society with people of color, with Muslims, with brown people, black people, whether coming from the south of the United States, whether coming from African countries, Asian countries, etc., and to flood them, to flood Europe, to flood the United States. But, says those on the far right, those brown people and those black people, they punch down in their racism. They're not smart enough. They're not good enough. They're not agile enough to engineer this takeover. Who's behind them? Remember the conspiracy theory? The Jew is doing this. So they punch up at the Jew. The powerful Jew is bringing these people to do that. There's been a failure on the mainstream right to look at those forces and say, this is antithetical to everything that we stand for. This is pure anti-Semitism. This is overt anti-Semitism, and this is dangerous. What was the killer in Pittsburgh yelling as the SWAT team was bringing him down? You will not destroy the white race.
Right.
The so-called manifesto of the murderer in Poway in San Diego, similarly, Jews are replacing us. So you have that on the right, and there hasn't been enough marginalization by leaders. There's been some, and on the left, I think there's been very little marginalization of it. Certainly when Representative Ilhan Omar, Minnesota, with her tweets, I think 3 of them that I can think of off the top of my head, which were overtly anti-Semitic.
Yeah, all about the Benjamins, Israel hypnotized the world.
Right. Exactly. Dual loyalty, puppet masters, etc. There was, at one point, Speaker Pelosi wanted to issue a declaration condemning that. And some people on the left said, oh, yes, but it also has to condemn racism, homophobia, et cetera. Like, you can't, the people on the left have a problem, and it's not only on the left, but the right too, but particularly on the left, seeing the Jew as victim. That's part of the problem. And because we don't present as victims of prejudice generally present. Generally, victims of prejudice present as financially oppressed, unable to get an education, in more vulnerable places within the society. We don't present like that.
But anybody think?
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step away.
Let me just finish my thought. But we know very well that can change on a dime.
So,
go ahead.
So that does now it's institutionalized. You have 2 members of Congress, Omar and Tlaib, who have, Tlaib accused us of dual loyalty, which is the old trope. And I mean, everyone would condemn the murderer, son of a gun, in Poway. I mean, that's even if he was not mainstream. Barry Weiss, who I'm certainly and
very good friend,
How to Fight Anti-Semitism. I want to read you something she wrote, which I thought was worth talking about, and because none of us want to see the Democratic Party move in that direction. She wrote, "It's hard to overstate the failure of those who claim to be the biggest defenders of liberal values, journalists, intellectuals, commentators, professors, feminists, gay rights activists, and so on, to speak up for Jews when the attacks come from the left. In the circles American Jews tend to travel in, calling out politicians like Republican Steve King is easy. Calling out Ilhan Omar is not." And I mean, you acknowledge that when in so many words. I'm not troubled. I'm troubled enough that the 2 of them hold positions in Congress, but I was particularly troubled that the leaders of the party, Senator Schumer and Congresswoman Pelosi, didn't make a public statement simply condemning what they said, not condemning their positions, but what they said about the Jews.
Pelosi tried, but
why did she have to try? Why didn't she just say it?
I think she, okay, I don't want to get into the, because I don't have the details right in front of me of what precise, but what I'm saying, she tried to get a resolution through, but there was some people who watered it down because we should condemn everything. It's interesting, I have to say that I was up on Capitol Hill while that resolution was being debated. I was in Washington, and I was asked to come up to Capitol Hill to meet with members of Congress from both parties, but particularly from those who are having trouble with it, to try to explain to them that, of course, all of these isms are to be condemned, but what we're facing right now is anti-Semitism. You know, and it's interesting. I just had a conversation with an acquaintance. I wouldn't call him a friend, but an acquaintance who was very troubled. He said to me, I don't like the slogan, Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. And I said to him, you know, remember that resolution about a year ago when we were so upset that they wouldn't focus on anti-Semitism, but I said, that's the equivalent flipped. No one is saying all lives don't matter, but Black lives matter too. They're the ones who are facing it right now.
It's an excellent point.
You know, sometimes you have to focus on the particular, and sometimes you have to go to the general.
Listen, I mean, every area has their. We all have to root it out wherever it is, and whether
Look,
on the left or the right.
I'm talking to you from the South. You know, where we have had governors who've been defeated because of trying to change a flag. That's changing now, but.
Let me ask you. I want to switch to since we're talking about here and now. The coronavirus, I know that you monitor such things very carefully. Have you seen an anti-Semitic theme or uptick related to the pandemic at all?
So far, it's been fringe, such as some of the examples I gave of the demonstrations in Michigan, in Ohio, in Illinois, in front of the various state capitals and other places. By and large, it's been fringe. But you've had things, I mean, I think she stopped, but Rosanna Arquette, the actress, not saying that she's a great, knowledgeable person on that, but a few months ago when the first talk of vaccines was becoming public, or more in the mainstream, there was note that Israel was working on a coronavirus vaccine. And she tweeted something, I shouldn't, you know, she's not alone, but Israel vaccine, the coronavirus, they must have known it was coming. You see those kinds of things. I can't say it's common, I can't say it's mainstream, but the association of Jews with the plague is not something new. Those of your congregation who are listening, watching this, some of you may remember the document, not having watched it in 1940, but and having seen it subsequent, the Hitler era, the National Socialist era documentary, The Eternal Jew. And one of the scenes in there is where somebody picks up a big sack of flour or rice and out scurry the most ugly, revolting rats. And those are the Jew. And then there's a map showing the Jew spreading the plague across the face of Europe. Jews were blamed for the bubonic plague, poisoning the wells. When you have an irrational fear, it's very easy to slip into somehow blaming the Jews. So that's why, you know, I haven't seen that much of it, but my antennae are up, so.
You know, it's interesting. You have spent your career focusing on the hatred of our people, and indeed, I also know you to be an unbelievably inspiring teacher of Judaism. That if someone were to follow you along and knew nothing of your work in the area of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, they would be very inspired to live a Jewish life because of your love of Judaism as well. You could have done either, and I suspect you get great joy for seeing Jews falling in love with Judaism, falling in love with Israel, as well as appreciating the horrors of what we've gone through. So I say that as a kind of a preface because you're both an expert on anti-Semitism, you're a university professor as well. College graduates today, do you say them their experiences, and we have, you know, a lot of our members send their kids to college, obviously, and
Emory,
yes, and support universities as well. Do you see college graduates in the West today becoming more or less inclined towards Israel as a result of their university experiences, or neither?
I think it's to a certain extent both, but there's a disturbing trend. Look, universities tend to be places where we criticize the status quo. We look out and we see what's wrong and what could be fixed. They tend to be places that certainly skew left, some would say more than skew. And I think it's difficult for a lot of students who are supporters of Israel, who don't know much about Israel. They have the most general outlines. But if they're continually seeing, both in the mainstream press and hearing in student groupings, a critique of Israel, it's confusing to them. And I said recently to a student, one of my students at Emory just graduated, a wonderful young man, who was on actually the Hillel board, the International Hillel board, as a student rep.
Right.
I said to him, you know what it seems to me, tell me if this is what's happening. And he said to me, I said, whereas students maybe 3-4 years ago might have gone, if they got accepted to a birthright program, might have gone running down the hall saying, guess what, I got this fabulous 10-day trip to Israel over winter break, over summer break, whatever
Right.
it is. I said, now they'll still go, but they're not skipping down the hall to proclaim it.
Wow.
And he said to me, you're right. And then a few weeks later, in the beginning of March, my last venture outside the confines of my home, actually, I was in DC for this academic year, so I was locked down in DC, not a bad place to be locked down if you want to monitor what's going on. But I was at the APAC gathering. And I met a young man who goes to NYU, and he created a pro-Israel, whatever, with Lions. I forget what the NYU, and there's probably some NYU alum now who, if we had the chat room on, would be telling us what the NYU mascot is. But he created the NYU group of X for Israel. So he chairs it, and it's active. And so I had to, he asked some very good questions. I pulled him aside after my presentation. I said, come, let's go have coffee. I wanted to pick his brain. So I ran this example by him. And he said, you're right. He said, I'll give you a personal example. I'm here at the APAC conference, and some of my friends asked me, not part of his pro-Israel group, my suite mates, etc., asked me, why am I going to DC for 3 days? And he said, I said to them, I have a foreign policy conference. He didn't say I'm going to APAC. He didn't say I'm going to a pro-Israel conference. He said, I just didn't want to get into a long debate and the discussion. He said, I fight for Israel all the time, but I didn't want it to get into that. So if someone like that, who does more for pro-Israel than most of us on this call and in this conversation, he's doing it all the time, he's doing it on campus, he's doing it often in a hostile atmosphere. If he's going to retreat in that, as you rabbis and many say, kal vachomer, how much more so someone who isn't.
You don't know. I have such a frustration. I want to dig into so many of these issues so much deeper with you, and I know at least I can't quite do it now, but I want to come back to that. I'm very troubled about what's going on in universities in America, and I think they're becoming a cauldron for anti-Semitism and anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, which to me are not so distinctive. Again, another discussion, but I want to move on to something else that's happening in America today, and it's vital that we talk about it. And I hear too, I know you have the pulse on things. Many Jews and many Jewish organizations, not all, but many have publicly come out in support of Black Lives Matter. I want you to tell me, because some of the issues in the Charter of Black Lives Matter have been problematic vis-a-vis Israel. I'm not sure everybody knows about them. I think it's important that we do know. I don't think that the average Black Lives Matter supporter feels anti-Israel, but the fact that there are things in their charter that are quite troubling, I can share the words, but you can just as easily. I want you to tell people what you know about it and what your thoughts are about it, because it's contemporary and it's important.
Right. I think what's important is to differentiate between the organization Black Lives Matter, which grew out of Ferguson from a few years ago,
right,
and the statement Black Lives Matter. I have said to people, yes, Black Lives Matter, and I support it. I'm not supporting the organization. I would not support the organization because the organization has adopted hostility, not not criticism of Israel, but depictions of Israel that are, I don't think we have to say, anti-Zionist coming close to anti-Semitic, but just are anti-Semitic.
Well,
but
it called Israel an apartheid state.
That's right.
And accused Israel of genocide. That's the irony, that, genocide against the Arabs. And the irony is, since Israel controlled the West Bank and Gaza since 1967, it's grown from 1 million to 4 million Arabs. It's the opposite of genocide. So wait, this is very important to me, because what you're saying,
go ahead.
is important. You're saying that you won't support the organization. You support the ideals of the group outside of it, but you personally would not support the organization because of their views.
Right. And it may be, splitting with a fine-tooth comb.
No,
but
it's important.
I think it's very important. As you said, and there are other things in the charter and statements that have been made by the leaders of the organization Black Lives Matter, that are anti-Semitic, no qualification. Simply put, when you accuse Israel of genocide, even with, you giving us facts don't matter to the prejudiced person, if only they did, utterly anti-Semitic. But when we've seen some of the things that have gone on in recent years, and they've gone on for a long time, except the difference now is everybody's walking around with a movie camera in their pocket, Right. So we're seeing them visually, and that when an African American is stopped for not every police officer, and not even the majority of police officers, but enough, even after what happened in Minnesota, that we're still seeing more examples of this, can give you a sense here in Atlanta, in New York and other places, of how deep this is. So it's Deborah, very troublesome.
So thank you for forgiving me. We have a lag, and I'm sorry, and I God forbid, I don't mean to interrupt you at all.
That's all right.
And if we were sitting as we have before face to face, we would have that body language, which works so beautifully. But because this is important, a lot of Jewish organizations have come out in support of the Black Lives Matter organization. When people say Black Lives Matter today, it doesn't just mean that a Black life matters. It means you're supporting the movement of the organization. You're saying that you don't support it, and yet a lot of Jewish organizations do. Does it trouble you then? Because I didn't know how you would respond, obviously. Does it trouble you that you're seeing so many Jewish organizations, including federations in some cases, publicly support a movement that you find to be, you fill in the word, but problematic?
Yeah, it's such a tough thing right now, because if you can get someone says, of course, Black lives. What it is, Black lives also matter. And so people say all lives matter, saying lots of people were killed in the Holocaust. It wasn't lots of people, it was Jews, primarily. Yes, there were some other people, but the Holocaust was the effort to annihilate Jews. And it's a very tough thing. And so much so, there have been people who have been kicked out of groups because they point out of the anti-Semitism of Black Lives Matter, and the people who hear it say, wait, you're condemning this whole movement. I wish there could have been some difference in the name, in the slogan, in the name of the organization, and the slogan in the best sense of the word. But I think it's one has to recognize it, one has to know it. But on the other hand, as Jews, and I know this is going to sound like, for some people, like liberal poppycock, but it's not. We often say it starts with the Jews, it doesn't end with the Jews. And we're taught Leviticus 19, I don't have to tell you, don't stand idly by. Justice shall you pursue in Deuteronomy. We can't stand idly by, and we can't say, oh, well, the organization is anti-Semitic, so I'm not going to do anything. That doesn't answer Breonna Taylor. That doesn't answer George Floyd. That doesn't answer Ahmaud Arbery in South Georgia, what happened here in Atlanta, and so many others. That's one of the reasons why it's such a tough time. And that's one of the reasons why in the beginning I said, I haven't seen that much, but my antennae are up.
Right. Well, listen, I think that what you're saying, if I can paraphrase, Jews can certainly support the cause. They may have some ambivalence about the issue. I know that if I didn't ask you about the president, people would ask me why I didn't ask you about the president. Share a few thoughts about the president. Vis-a-vis Jews and Israel in particular.
Right. Look, he's done some things vis-a-vis Israel that have made the Israeli government very happy, very pleased, moving the embassy, declaring in terms of terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. And many Israelis love that, and people worried with the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, the violence, there wasn't. I don't know what will happen if the annexation goes through. That's yet to be seen. And you can't take that away from President Trump, and you can't take that away from this administration. They deserve the credit for it, and they deserve to have it acknowledged. Having said that, I think there's been a real failure on his part to say to those of his ardent followers, not all his followers, but certainly those of the far right, those who whether it was in golf carts at the villages in Florida, yelling white power, white supremacy slogans, etc., or who have participated in these anti-lockdown demonstrations at state capitals. You don't speak for me. This is not what I stand for. There hasn't been the marginalization that you spoke of at the beginning of this conversation. And if there's one thing I would say to the members of your congregation, so many of whom are so deeply involved and aware in terms of politics, is that if you're on the political right, you will eat many on the political, let me not say, many people on the political right have no trouble spotting anti-Semitism on the political left. BDS, Campus, Corbyn, Black Lives Matter, whatever it is, the organization. And they're right. They're absolutely right. They are spot on. And I know lots of people on the left who have no trouble spotting anti-Semitism on the right. They can tell me exactly what went on in Charlottesville, what went on in Pittsburgh, what went on in Poway, what went on at these different rallies. The problem is those people, all of us, should be looking not across the political transom, but look to your neighbor. Look to the person who shares so many of your other political views and say, stop it. If you're going to behave like that, I can't be part of it. That's anti-Semitism. We have to clean our own houses, because if you only see it on the other side of the political transom, then you're not really fighting anti-Semitism, you're scoring political points. And I think so I say it to everyone of each political stripe. You know, if you want to have a lively, when we once again have dinner parties and you want a lively dinner party, invite me. Because if they're conservative around the table, I'll sound like a flaming liberal. And if they're liberals around the table, I'll sound like an arch conservative. But both sides.
I have to say, I know that you have done the job very well tonight, because you've probably inflamed everybody a little bit. And you probably made each of us look inside a little bit deeper. I mean that sincerely. Obviously I know who you are for many years. I've read your things, but I don't know how you're going to answer these specific questions. I don't share the questions with guests in advance, or even the areas. And I have to say, someone's going to send me an email. How could she say that? And someone on the other side is going to say, how could she say that? So let me close with this. I just want to say that, we are blessed as Jews with a lot of great scholars. We're blessed with a lot of great speakers, but there are very few that have that combination. This is our, third maybe dialogue together. By the way, Deborah, you haven't changed since the first one, I think 25 years ago. Your hair is still red. I'm told I may have a few gray streaks. I don't see them, by the way. But I want to conclude by reading.
It's very long. I'm waiting for that haircut.
Okay. I want to conclude by reading something from this most recent book. Here it is, everybody, which is a correspondence that you have with two fictional acquaintances from Emory. One is named Abigail. She's a student. And these are the final words of a letter you wrote to her. Indeed, it's the concluding words of your book. You write, "This need for Jews to balance the oi with the joy is an exhortation that could well be shared with many other groups that have become the objects of discrimination and prejudice. To you and all your peers whom I have had the good fortune to have taught, and whose questions have inspired me to explore this topic from a variety of perspectives, I say in the words of the Hebrew scriptures, be strong and of good courage. Never stop fighting the good fight, even as you rejoice in who you are. Your grateful teacher, Deborah Lipstadt." And I want to say, Dr. Lipstadt, with teachers like you, it's far more likely that all of us are going to fight the good fight and rejoice along the way. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Pleasure. And I hear that thunderous applause in the background. I really do.